Sometimes a single photograph can rewrite the story of an entire life. One moment, captured in time, becomes the lens through which the world sees everything that follows. The subject becomes frozen in that frame, unable to step beyond its borders, unable to reclaim their narrative from the hands of others. In courtrooms across America, this happens every day. A person walks in as themselves and walks out as a symbol, a headline, a cautionary tale shaped not by the evidence presented but by the story the world has already decided to tell. The gavel falls, the verdict is read, but the most important truths often remain locked away, sealed in files that will never see daylight. What happens when justice is served but the full story is never heard? When the public forms its judgment from fragments and shadows, missing the pieces that might change everything? In the space between what happened and what we think we know, lives are transformed, reputations are destroyed, and sometimes the most crucial evidence never makes it past the courthouse doors. This is the story of secrets that shaped a verdict and the silence that followed. The photograph appeared in newspapers around the world. A woman in an elegant suit walking purposefully through courthouse doors, surrounded by a sea of cameras and shouting reporters. Her face composed, almost serene, as if she were attending a social gathering rather than facing charges that could end her life as she knew it. But photographs lie. They capture a fraction of a second and ask us to believe it represents eternity. This dramatized narrative is inspired by real legal principles and public case records. It is presented for educational and entertainment purposes, with interpretations attributed to their respective sources. The story began long before that courthouse photograph, in the kind of circles where power moves quietly and wealth speaks in whispers. Ghislaine Maxwell had spent decades as a fixture in these circles, a connector of influential people, a facilitator of introductions that shaped politics and business across continents. She was the daughter of a media mogul, educated at Oxford, fluent in multiple languages, comfortable in boardrooms and ballrooms alike. Her life had been one of privilege and access, of private jets and exclusive parties, of relationships that opened doors most people never even knew existed. Then came Jeffrey Epstein. Their relationship would become the defining element of her existence, though the true nature of it remained shrouded in questions that would never be fully answered. Was she a victim who became complicit, a willing participant from the beginning? A woman who found herself trapped in circumstances that spiraled beyond her control? The prosecutors would paint her as a predator. The defense would argue she was a scapegoat. The truth, as always in cases that capture the public imagination, was likely more complex than either narrative allowed. When Epstein died in his jail cell in August 2019, the world lost its primary target for accountability. The public's hunger for justice didn't disappear with him. It simply transferred its focus to the woman who had been by his side for so many years. Maxwell became the face of Epstein's crimes, the only person left standing who could be held accountable for a network of abuse that had allegedly operated for decades. She transformed from a supporting character in someone else's story to the central figure in one of the most closely watched trials of the decade. But here's what the public didn't know, what the cameras couldn't capture, what the headlines never reported. The grand juries that indicted both Epstein and Maxwell heard testimony from exactly two witnesses. Not victims, not eyewitnesses, not co-conspirators. Two law enforcement officials who summarized the government's investigation in single-day proceedings. No victim ever spoke directly to the grand jury that decided Maxwell should face trial. The irony was profound. A case built on the testimonies of women who claimed they had been silenced for years reached its first major milestone through a process that never actually gave them a voice. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had seen its share of high-profile trials, but the Maxwell case brought a different kind of intensity. The media circus outside was matched by the careful choreography inside, where every word would be scrutinized, every piece of evidence dissected, every legal maneuver analyzed by a watching world. Judge Allison Nathan presided with the kind of measured authority that high-stakes trials demand. She understood that this case carried weight far beyond the charges against a single defendant. It represented something larger in the public consciousness, a reckoning with power and privilege, with systems that had allegedly allowed abuse to continue unchecked. The prosecution team from the Southern District of New York carried the burden of proving their case without their primary witness. Epstein's death had removed the person who could have provided the most direct testimony about the alleged conspiracy. Instead, they would have to build their case through documents, photographs, flight logs, and the testimonies of women who claimed Maxwell had facilitated their abuse years, or even decades earlier. The defense faced a different challenge. How do you defend someone who has already been convicted in the court of public opinion? How do you separate a client from the crimes of someone else, especially when that someone else can no longer speak for himself? Maxwell's attorneys would argue that she was being prosecuted for Epstein's crimes because prosecutors needed someone to blame. They would claim that memories from decades past were unreliable, that the government had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, that their client was a victim of circumstance rather than a criminal mastermind. As you listen, notice how easily this could be anyone's life, transformed by association, defined by proximity to events beyond their control. The evidence that would be presented at trial included elements that had fascinated the public for years. Flight logs from Epstein's private aircraft, showing a parade of famous names who had traveled on what tabloids called the Lolita Express. Photographs of Maxwell and Epstein together at social events, their body language suggesting an intimacy that prosecutors would argue went far beyond friendship. Bank records showing payments that the government claimed were for recruiting and grooming victims. Testimony from pilots who had flown Epstein's planes, from household staff who had worked at his properties, from law enforcement officials who had investigated his activities. But there were also pieces of evidence that would never reach the jury, secrets that would remain locked away even as the trial played out in full view of the world. The famous Little Black Book that contained hundreds of names and contact numbers was deemed too sensitive for public release. Only specific pages, those directly related to the charges against Maxwell, would be allowed as evidence. The rest remained sealed, protecting the privacy of individuals whose only crime may have been knowing someone who committed crimes. More significantly, thousands of hours of surveillance footage from Epstein's properties remained in government custody, never to be seen by the public or even by the jury deciding Maxwell's fate. What those videos might have shown, who they might have implicated or exonerated, became another layer of secrecy in a case that the public believed was about transparency. The surveillance footage represented perhaps the most tantalizing mystery of all. If Epstein had indeed been recording his guests, as some alleged, those recordings could have provided definitive proof of who knew what and when they knew it. They could have revealed the true scope of any conspiracy, or they could have exonerated those who had been unfairly implicated. Instead, they remained locked away, their contents known only to investigators who would never discuss them publicly. The prosecution's case would rest heavily on the testimonies of 4 women who claimed Maxwell had facilitated their abuse when they were teenagers. These women, now adults, would have to recount experiences from decades past, describing how they claimed Maxwell had groomed them, manipulated them, and delivered them to Epstein. Their stories were compelling and heartbreaking. They spoke of being young, vulnerable, and desperate for money when they encountered Maxwell. They described how she allegedly gained their trust, how she made them feel special and sophisticated, how she gradually introduced them to increasingly inappropriate situations. But memory is fragile, especially memory of trauma. The defense would challenge these accounts, pointing to inconsistencies, questioning the reliability of decades-old recollections, arguing that the passage of time and the influence of media coverage had contaminated the witnesses' memories. The prosecution would counter that trauma victims often have imperfect memories, that inconsistencies in detail don't negate the core truth of their experiences, that these women had nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward. The jury would have to navigate these competing narratives, deciding not just what they believed had happened, but what they could prove had happened beyond a reasonable doubt. As the trial progressed, a parallel drama was unfolding in the jury room that would later threaten to overturn everything. One juror, later identified as Scotty David, had answered no on his pre-trial questionnaire when asked whether he had ever been a victim of sexual abuse. During deliberations, however, he would share with his fellow jurors that he had indeed been sexually abused as a child. He would later tell reporters that his personal experience helped convince skeptical jurors that the prosecution witnesses should be believed, that their accounts of abuse were credible. The revelation would create a legal crisis that wouldn't emerge until after the verdict was delivered. Had the juror deliberately concealed his history to get on the jury? Had he forgotten about his own trauma when filling out the questionnaire? Was his presence on the jury grounds for a mistrial? The answers to these questions would remain as murky as everything else in a case where truth seemed to exist in layers, each one revealing new complexities while hiding others. Hiding others. Judge Nathan's courtroom had become a theater where truth wore different masks depending on who was watching. The wooden benches filled each morning with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case through years of speculation and sensational headlines. Maxwell sat at the defense table with a composure that seemed almost otherworldly. Her attorneys had coached her well on courtroom demeanor, but there was something deeper in her bearing, a kind of resignation that suggested she understood the weight of representing something larger than herself. The prosecution presented their case methodically, piece by carefully selected piece. They showed the jury photographs of Maxwell and Epstein together, images that spanned decades and continents. In these pictures, they appeared as partners, conspirators, two people whose lives had become so intertwined that separating their actions became nearly impossible. Flight logs revealed a pattern of travel that prosecutors claimed showed a coordinated effort to transport victims. The names on those passenger manifests read like a directory of global influence, former presidents and prime ministers, celebrities and business titans all taking to the skies on aircraft that prosecutors suggested were tools of a criminal enterprise. Yet something crucial was missing from this evidence. The flight logs showed who traveled, when they traveled, and where they went. They did not show why they traveled or what happened during those journeys. The gaps between the documented facts left room for interpretation, and interpretation had become the battlefield on which Maxwell's fate would be decided. As you listen, notice how easily this could be anyone's life, transformed by association, defined by proximity to events beyond their control. The defense strategy became clear as the trial progressed. They would not deny that Maxwell had been close to Epstein. The evidence made such a denial impossible. Instead, they would argue that proximity did not equal complicity, that being present did not mean being culpable. Maxwell's attorneys painted her as a woman who had found herself trapped in Epstein's orbit, unable to escape even as she realized the true nature of his activities. They suggested that she too was a victim, manipulated by a man who had a documented history of exploiting women. This narrative created its own moral paradox. If Maxwell was indeed a victim, then prosecuting her became an act of further victimization. If she was a willing participant, then her apparent composure in court suggested either remarkable self-control or disturbing indifference. The jury would have to navigate these competing interpretations while the world watched and waited for a verdict that would satisfy a public hungry for accountability. The prosecution witnesses took the stand one by one, their testimonies forming the emotional center of the case. These women, now adults, described their teenage encounters with Maxwell in detail that was both specific and hazy, precise about feelings while uncertain about dates and locations. Their accounts shared common elements that prosecutors argued proved a systematic pattern of abuse. Maxwell allegedly approached them when they were young and vulnerable, often from troubled backgrounds or difficult financial situations. She presented herself as a mentor, someone who could provide opportunities and connections in exchange for what she initially described as innocent massage services. The transition from legitimate massage to sexual abuse was gradual, according to their testimonies. Maxwell allegedly normalized inappropriate behavior slowly, making each step seem like a natural progression rather than a criminal escalation. But the defense challenged these narratives at every turn. They pointed to inconsistencies in the women's stories, differences in their accounts that had emerged over years of interviews with law enforcement, civil attorneys, and journalists. They suggested that media coverage had influenced memory, that the prospect of financial settlements had motivated embellishment. The challenge facing the jury was profound. How do you weigh decades-old memories against documented evidence? How do you separate genuine trauma from potentially influenced recollection? How do you balance the presumption of innocence against the moral imperative to believe victims? These questions had no easy answers, and the jury's deliberations would reflect that complexity. The evidence that never reached the courtroom became almost as significant as what did. The sealed surveillance footage represented thousands of hours of potential testimony that would never be heard. If Epstein had indeed recorded his guests, as some investigations suggested, those recordings could have provided definitive answers to questions that remained shrouded in speculation. Instead, they remained locked in government custody, their contents known only to investigators who were bound by secrecy. The public was left to wonder what those videos might have revealed, who they might have implicated or exonerated. The sealed portions of Maxwell's address book created similar mysteries. The published excerpts had already revealed connections to hundreds of prominent individuals, but the complete document remained classified. The logic was sound, protecting the privacy of people who had committed no crimes beyond knowing someone who allegedly had. Yet this protection also meant that the full scope of Epstein's network would never be publicly known. The investigation had uncovered connections that stretched across industries and continents, relationships that had the potential to reshape public understanding of how power and influence operate in elite circles. The decision to keep this information sealed reflected a careful balance between transparency and privacy. But it also meant that the complete story would never be told. During the trial's most intense moments, when witness testimonies became emotional and evidence seemed overwhelming, it was easy to forget that this case represented just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Maxwell's prosecution was the only criminal accountability that would ever emerge from decades of alleged abuse. The other names in the flight logs would never face charges. The powerful individuals who had associated with Epstein would never have to answer questions under oath about what they knew and when they knew it. The systems that had allegedly allowed abuse to continue unchecked would never be fully examined. Maxwell became the singular focus of justice in a case that suggested institutional failures spanning multiple jurisdictions and decades. She carried the weight of representing something much larger than her individual actions. When the verdict was finally read, Maxwell stood motionless as the words washed over her. Guilty on 5 of 6 counts. The courtroom erupted in whispers and shuffling papers, but she remained frozen in that moment, perhaps understanding that she was no longer a person, but a symbol of accountability in a story much larger than herself. The jury had spoken, but their deliberations revealed the complexity that had defined the entire case. Some jurors later described feeling conflicted, wrestling with evidence that painted a picture without showing the complete canvas. They had convicted based on what they could prove, not necessarily what they believed had happened. Judge Nathan would later reduce some of the charges, and Maxwell would receive a 20-year sentence. But the legal resolution could not resolve the deeper questions that had emerged during the trial. The secrets that never reached the jury remained locked away, creating a permanent shadow over what justice had actually accomplished. The surveillance footage stays sealed. The complete address book remains classified. The full scope of the network that prosecutors suggested existed will never be publicly known. In seeking justice for specific victims, the system protected the privacy of those who may have been connected without being complicit. Perhaps that is the real legacy of this case. Justice served and secrets preserved, accountability delivered and mysteries maintained. In the space between what we proved and what we'll never know lies the eternal tension of how truth operates in a world where some doors remain forever closed. The photograph from that first day outside the courthouse has been replaced by others now. But the questions it raised about power, privilege, and the price of proximity to dangerous people will linger long after the headlines fade. Sometimes the most important verdict is the one that reminds us how much we still don't understand about the shadows where justice and secrecy meet.